All right, hello my friends, my name is Darren Gerdes. Today is Sunday, June 21st, 2024, and this is the Daily Brief. If you're looking for Ukraine war news, this is the place where you'll find it every morning, and then three big stories in the evening. Okay, 1,100 Russians off the battlefield, 9 tanks, 46 armored combat vehicles, 44 artillery pieces, 68 vehicles and fuel tanks. It's ticked up a little bit over the last few days. From the last few days. It's been down for the last 3 days, about 100 or 200 Russian casualties, but it's starting to uptick. Overnight, Russia conducted a fairly large Shahed drone attack. Out of 39 launched, 35 were shot down by air defense. A Russian Kh-59-69 cruise missile was taken down due to preemptive countermeasures. I don't know if any other missiles got through, but that's what I've been able to find so far. This night alone, the Russian army used almost 40 Shahed UAVs against Ukraine, and it's important to note that most of them were shot down by our sky defenders. Yet, this is what it looks like when things get through. This is what this looks like. It's just utter destruction wherever the Russians go. This is what the Ukrainian city of Toretsk looks like in the Donetsk region, and this is what another city looks like. It's just destruction wherever the Russians go. Okay, the ISW, Russian military regroups forces near Vovchansk for renewed assaults. Now, Vovchansk was largely pushed back or cleared out, not completely, but pretty close to, and they're regrouping. The Ukrainian military reports that Russia has transferred additional assault units to northern Kharkiv. So maybe they're looking for round two. Now, yesterday I was talking about a strike on an airfield. Satellite images show damage to Russian airfield in Rostov Oblast after a reported drone strike, but they didn't really get much. They didn't get planes, for example, but they did destroy a warehouse and other stuff. Russian Defense Ministry claimed that Ukraine attacked the region with 26 drones overnight on July 19th to 20th. That's the day before yesterday to yesterday. Data indicates that fires broke out at a warehouse, the technical operational unit hangar, and an area of open field. Photos also appear to substantiate Russian officials' claims that no aircraft were damaged in the strike. So that's what we know. People took to the streets yesterday in Krasnodar because they were out of power for a whole day. And they also took to the streets in the Russian city of Anapa to protest against power cuts as well. Meanwhile, Ukrainians have been out or having rolling power outages for months on end, but they're protesting over a day without power. Ukrainian defenders from the 14th Separate Regiment of Unmanned Aircraft Complexes have destroyed a Russian Buk SAM in Zaporizhia region, reportedly with a HIMARS strike. So there we are there. But they don't need to use HIMARS. Sometimes the Russians do things to themselves. This is from Kommersant, which reported that the supply of low-quality bearings led to the failure of 5 Il-76 transports, which caused substantial damage to the legally protected interests of the state, represented by the Russian Ministry of Defense. So, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Perhaps this is the effect of sanctions actually doing some of what sanctions are supposed to do. But sanctions alone just don't do enough. Ukraine rushes to create AI-enabled war drones. Ukraine hopes a rollout of AI-enabled drones across the front line will help it overcome increasing signal jamming by Russians. So drones have been effective, and then each side is learning how to jam the other's drones, and so AI is a way of overcoming the signal jamming by having artificial intelligence lock into what exactly they want to destroy and just go after it. When you try to scale up with human pilots, it just doesn't work. We're talking about human drone pilots. For a swarm of 10 or 20 drones or robots, it's virtually impossible for humans to manage them. Swarmer is one of the more than 200 tech firms that have sprung up since Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. I've got to say, when the war is over, Ukraine has this entrepreneurial culture that is going to thrive on the back end of this war. It's just going to be astonishing to watch. Signal jamming, the need for AI-enabled drones, is becoming more pressing as both sides roll out electronic warfare systems that disrupt signals between pilots and drones. The only thing that I can think that's going to be the next iteration will be something that will fry circuit boards or do something that will just make it malfunction and then fall to the ground. But right now they've been able to jam the signal, and until they can do something like that, drones are going to be pervasive. He predicted that AI-operated FPV drones could post hit rates of around 80%. They just lock on and then they just go after it. It'll be all like the Terminator out there. Okay, so Zelensky sat for an interview the other day, and the interviewer asked, "Did your heart sink last week when President Biden, standing right next to you, introduced you as President Putin of all people?" And Zelensky wisely, diplomatically answered, "No, he just made a mistake. Honestly, for me, it means nothing." Now, that was a great answer. What would it gain Zelensky to say, that was kind of a terrible thing? I mean, we're fighting against this evil dictator, and he called me the evil dictator, but again, this could have driven a wedge between Zelensky and Biden. So it was almost a setup. Tim Snyder also recognized this. He said that he's leading people facing a genocidal war of aggression. He is unlikely to be distracted by our gotcha culture. And that's what that question was. And okay. Anyway, Russians disseminate fakes about a man killed by Ukrainian border guards. Now, I remember reading this a couple weeks ago, and something just didn't pass the sniff test. It was on the Moldovan border. On July 13th, a Ukrainian citizen's body was discovered on Moldovan territory near the Ukrainian border. Almost a week later, Russian news agencies and propagandists were actively disseminating information that the man had been killed by gunfire fired by Ukrainian border guards. Ukraine's State Border Guard Service stated that the Russians are disseminating disinformation. The material is false, provocative, and it was distributed to defame Ukrainian State Border Guard Service representatives and destabilize the situation in the state. So I gave this one a pass, and I was like, something's not quite right. Well, turns out, yeah, you see enough of this, you start questioning things. Okay, now this is from Visegrad, which is not the most trustworthy source, but this keeps happening in other places, so I'm going to bring the story forward. Spanish police arrest 3 men suspected of having been paid by Russian security services to carry out cyber attacks. Because this has happened elsewhere, I'm highlighting this, but even if Visegrad is less than reliable, and so I try to be careful about my sources, but I think there's probably something here. Fined for yellow and blue shoes. This is from the BBC. How Russian laws smother dissent. Dissent is not tolerated in Vladimir Putin's Russia. For years, Kremlin critics have faced a host of laws which could be used against them. Most recently, there are laws like this. She's fined for wearing yellow and blue shoes, because she's discrediting the Russian army. Okay, another recent law penalizes discrediting the Russian army, and it happened to be applied to a broad variety of actions interpreted either as support for Ukraine or criticism of the war. These include wearing clothes in the blue and yellow colors of the Ukrainian flag, writing anti-war slogans on cakes, dyeing one's hair blue and yellow, or listening to Ukrainian music. Now listen to this one. Anti-war posters with messages ranging from no war to 8 asterisks, which is the number of Russian letters that spell no war, or even just a blank sheet of paper. You can get arrested for that. Okay, so that tells you everything you need to know about the authoritarian nature of Russian society at the moment. The Cardinal Secretary of State of Vatican City has come to Ukraine. He's dealing with some religious issues, but he's also going to be meeting with President Zelensky. Any help from any quarter should be welcomed. Biden speaks with von der Leyen on her re-election as European Commission President. This happened like 2 or 3 days ago that she was re-elected. The U.S. President and EU Commission Chief discussed efforts to hold Russia accountable for its aggression in Ukraine, but Biden has his own problems right now. Poland, meanwhile, is calling on the EU to stress ties with the U.S. to counter Russian disinformation. Poland calls for positive action ahead of the U.S. presidential election to counter Russian disinformation. You notice that nobody's ever saying, we got to watch out for those polls. We got to watch out for those Lithuanians. It's always about Russia. Russia's always the threat to everyone in the region. Okay, according to the ISW, Russian defense minister engages mill bloggers, that's ultranationalist Russians writing about the war, in a bid to improve the Ministry of Defense's image. Anytime you have to engage in image management, you know that you have an underlying problem. The US-based Institute for the Study of War reported on 20 July that Russian Minister of Defense Belousov has held multiple meetings with Kremlin-affiliated military bloggers in an apparent effort to improve the Ministry of Defense's standing among pro-war Russian ultranationalists. One prominent Kremlin-affiliated mill blogger expressed optimism, stating hope that Belousov and the Ministry of Defense will eliminate all the painful malfunctions among Russian forces in Ukraine sooner or later. Another mill blogger claimed that Belousov specifically promised to build shelters at military airfields to protect against Ukrainian drone strikes, addressing a major concern within the pro-war ultranationalist community. So, that tells you where the Russians actually are. I mean, they are bad. They are doing terrible things to Ukraine. They are, they have significant strength, but they also have significant issues simultaneously. Several European nations have reintroduced or expanded conscription. And again, it's because of Russia. It's not because of Estonia or Poland or whatever other nation. It's always because of Russia. A number of European countries halted mandatory conscription after the end of the Cold War, but several nations, particularly in Scandinavia and the Baltics, have reintroduced it in recent years, largely because of the Russian threat. Latvia is the latest to implement conscription. In April, Norway presented an ambitious long-term plan that will nearly double the country's defense budget and add 20,000 conscripted soldiers. But perhaps the most surprising transformation is underway in Germany, which, since the end of World War II, has had an aversion to militarization. And that's understandable. Boris Pistorius presented a proposal in June for new voluntary military service. Listen to this. We must be ready for war by 2029, he said. Like, they see writing on the wall. Now, one more thing I want to highlight here. Finland has the capacity to activate more than 900,000 reservists, with 280,000 military personnel being ready to respond immediately if needed. Now, that's what Europe is bracing against. They recognize the threat, but hopefully peaceful evenings will return, but the hard work continues. All right, my friends, that's all that I have for today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.